Hello, and welcome to the Smart Injury Doctors Podcast, the injury market's top program for doctors, lawyers, and insurers who want to gain greater insight on how to improve patient recovery results and deliver better services in the U.S. injury market. Please welcome your host, Dr. Jeffrey Allen Kronk.
Okay, doctors, today what I want to talk about is guidelines. So I have over 2,500 doctors involved in some way or another on my educational platforms. I have over 1,200 attorneys that we communicate with monthly across the country. And this is basically, 39, 40 some states across the country that we're typically in. And so I get a lot of feedback from a lot of doctors of things that I hear other doctors say, or coaches say, or consultants. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with coaching or consulting. As a matter of fact, I'm a huge fan of it. In my private practice, I starved to death for the first 2 years, hired a coach. It cost me $12,500 to do it. I mean, I was dead broke. This was back in 92. And so 12,000, I think it's 12,500. 12,500 today would probably be, 30,000, 25,000. So anyway, I hired a consultant, and I mean, my practice took off. And I never was without a consultant in my private practice. And even with my businesses today, I'm constantly hiring consultants or top of the line people that can help me in marketing, help me to understand things better. So I've never ever shied away from that, and I don't think you should either. So this is not a rant on coaches or consultants or anything else, but it is a little bit of a rant on anybody that runs down guidelines. So I hear across the country doctors saying, "Hey, this person or that person says that the insurers do not respect guidelines. They don't respond to, say, the Croft treatment guidelines." And I say, "Oh my God, that's so ridiculous." You have to understand what guidelines are. First of all, they're a synthesis of all of the information that a particular group has. So let's say chiropractic guidelines. So let's just say like an ICA best practice guidelines or a Croft treatment guideline. Art Croft did a lot of research, and he came out with some of the first guidelines that chiropractors ever had for insurance inclusion. And those guidelines are very friendly toward treatment. They're very friendly toward results. And they come after years and years of experience and years of utilization. Now, if an insurer says, "Well, we don't really like these," you might as well say, "Hey, we really want to cut your bill. We really want to cause reductions. We want to have things in place that will allow us to cut off care prematurely." Because in my program, the Smart Injury Doctors program, I teach doctors to list out the guidelines that you use, because those are the guidelines that you'll be judged against. And you should know what your guidelines are. You should know, hey, if I'm using impairment guidelines, or if I'm using surgical guidelines, or if I'm using athletic return to play parameter guidelines, or if I'm using treatment guidelines, if I'm using Croft treatment guidelines, if I'm using the Compass guidelines, if I'm using the ICA best practice guidelines, if I'm using the practicing committee on chiropractic practitioners. Whatever guidelines you're using, you should know what your guidelines are, because that's what allows you to sleep at night. That's what allows you, and especially in the personal injury space, that's what allows you to sleep at night. So, one of the things that providers seem to forget about, in my experience, is they forget about things. They don't realize bad times can be right around the corner. So what's a bad time? Well, a bad time is, let's say an insurer says, "Hey, for the last 3 years, we think you've been over-treating." That can be a bad time for the doctor. And they can say, "Hey, we think we've overpaid you by this amount. We want you to defend yourself. And now in your documentation, there's so much under documentation, and you haven't listed what guidelines you use." So of course, their experts can use whatever guidelines they would like, or lack thereof guidelines, or even using guidelines. So guidelines are what protect you. Guidelines are what expand the profession itself. Guidelines are something that a lot of people work a long time and contribute a lot of hours to. I'm not talking about, oh wow, they gave up 10 hours. I'm talking about thousands and thousands of hours. If you look at the ICA best practice guidelines, I don't know, maybe it's 10,000 hours, maybe it's 50,000 hours. I don't know how many hours it would be. But when I look at it and what people had to do and how many committee members there were, it's a lot of hours. I've never asked Art Croft how many hours he's put into research and how many hours they spent on guidelines, but I'm going to tell you that it's more than what you would think. And it's really disrespectful not to acknowledge that by saying, oh, the insurer doesn't respect these guidelines. Well, the insurer doesn't respect you necessarily. The insurer looks at you like, hey, you're a biased person that's just trying to do whatever you can to get money and squeeze money out of the insurance carrier. Some people might look at you like that. Right? And so what do you have against it? Well, if somebody's looking at you or if somebody's investigating you, what guidelines are you using? And I'm going to tell you, the Croft treatment guidelines are great. They're great guidelines. They're incorporated in a lot of other guidelines. For those of you that don't, if it's still valid out on the internet, just look up the Croft treatment guidelines and you're going to see the Oklahoma Chiropractic Board, if it's still out there. And you're going to see a story that they're telling that made utilization of the chiropractic guidelines so important for them. Because you'll see how they picked up abuses of doctors and how those guidelines knocked those abuses out. Georgia, the state of Georgia, has a great rule. In the state of Georgia, chiropractors who are going to deny bills have to be licensed under the state board as certified to do so. And when they do so, they have to have really good rationale for what they're doing, or guess what? The other doctor can file a board complaint. So these are areas where you go, wow, that's fantastic, right? Because everyone's actually had really bad reviews. If you're in injury work long enough, or you're in clinical setting long enough, you're accepting insurance long enough, you're going to have reviews, and you're going to have some bad reviews, some bad IME, some bad utilization rules. You where are they even coming from? Right? Well, when that happens, the thing that protects you are guidelines. I am a huge advocate of guidelines. These guidelines are so protective and they're so good, and it takes literally 10 seconds to put documentation in place. It's very, very simple. That now protects you. That now says, hey, these are the guidelines I used. These are the guidelines I need to be judged against. And for any of you that think that guidelines are not important, go read the ICA best practice guidelines. Now, it's not easy reading, but when you read it, you'll go, wow, this is very, very protective. If I look and I say, well, what is an X-ray guideline? I'm big into X-ray. What's the X-ray guideline say? Well, it says you have to be able to do a subluxation analysis, and unfortunately, half the profession I don't think knows what that is. Right? It's the simplest thing in the world to do. You got a misalignment that causes nerve interference. You're looking for it. And you're looking for it on X-ray, and you're clinically correlating. It also says that you have to rule out any fractures with your X-rays. It says that you have to rule out or rule in soft tissue damage. Soft tissue damage is picked up with flexion extension. It says that you have to rule out or rule in if there's any sort of disease state there. You have to do a spinal instability evaluation. You have to count the vertebra and know how many vertebrae there are. You have to look for any anomalies, and you do all of this, and you have to note any degenerative change, and you do all of this to set up an appropriate treatment plan for your treatment. That's what it says just under the X-ray guidelines. Now I could say, well, what do the Nexus guidelines say? North American Emergency X-ray Utilization Nexus. So if I looked at Nexus and said, well, what does Nexus say? What do they say under their guidelines? And man, it's like beautiful. I got midline spine tenderness, I got X-ray. If I have a neurological focal deficit, I got an X-ray. What does that mean? Well, if I think the nerve's being interfered with, I got an X-ray. If I think the cord's being interfered with, I got an X-ray. If I think the brain's being interfered with, I got an X-ray. It also says if I got any distracting problems, I've got an X-ray. Well, what's a distracting injury? Well, twofold of a distracting injury. A distracting injury is one where I'm so damn distracted by the injury, I lost my hand. I cut off my hand, but I also dislocated my shoulder. Well, guess what? Because I lost my hand, I'm looking at my hand on the ground and it hurts so damn bad, I'm so distracted, I've taken my attention off the fact that I got a dislocated shoulder. That's one form of a distracting injury. The other form is when you have a bone or ligament injury. And if you have an auto injury, how do you not have a distracting injury? You have to have a distracting injury. And then it's basically going to say, hey, if the person is intoxicated, I got an x-ray. Hey, it also says if the person has any sort of cognitive problems, I got an x-ray. Right? So these x-rays, when you look at the guidelines and somebody knows the guidelines, usually when somebody's saying, these guidelines or the insurers don't know the guidelines, I could go to that expert and say, what do these guidelines say? And they don't know. But yet they're going to promote the insurance line that they're not valuable. And I think that's ridiculous. I think it's more than ridiculous. I think it's very harmful. You don't want to do that. You don't want to invalidate the hard work of the people that have come before you to give you the rights that you have. Instead, you need to strengthen them, you need to flow power to them, and then you need to enhance them. Not take away from them, not run from them, not poo-poo them. That to me is a huge mistake. I know it's not quite the beginning of the year. This will be the last podcast that I have before the end of the year. I just wanted to touch on that point because it's come up so much in like the last 10 days. So I thought I'd touch on it. Doctors, if you want more information about our program, I have a Smart Injury Doctors program. You just go to smartinjurydoctors.com, pull it up. If you want a meeting with me, you pull it up and you get right into my schedule. You can basically schedule right into my schedule and find out more about what we do. If you're listening to this podcast and my other podcasts, you get a feel for what we do. If you want to align with us, again, I have over 2,500 doctors on our educational platforms. I have over 1,200 attorneys, and this is rising. This is not going down. We have really good goals for next year. For next year being starting in 2 days. So doctors, I would end by saying I very much appreciate your time and your attention always on these. I hope you've had a good 2024 and I hope you have a great 2025. I look forward to delivering more content on the next podcast.
You've been listening to the Smart Injury Doctors Podcast, the #1 audio production show for professionals in the U.S. injury market that want to deliver better injury services to the patients, clients, or insureds they serve. If you like what you heard today, please leave us a review and don't forget to join us on our next program.